Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber. Starting in 1978, this fellow sent homemade bombs both to airlines and to university personnel, including professors. There were 3 people who died as a result of his bombs, 28 additional people who were injured. In 1995, they finally figured out who this guy was and located him at a remote cabin he had in Montana. This guy, as the chart shows here, the slide, had a recorded IQ of 167, was admitted to Harvard at age 16. His PhD from the University of Michigan in mathematics, when he wrote his dissertation, as I've read, there were only 5 people in the world who could understand what he was writing. One of those was on his committee, luckily. A very brilliant guy, but one disconnected from his conscience. He was, in fact, diagnosed with mental illness, and that was the reason why he was able to bargain, his attorney was able to bargain for life sentences instead of the death penalty. He's 78 years old and is still in federal penitentiary out in Colorado. One strange scoundrel sociopath. Here's another guy who's not as bright but just as strange, Marshall Applewhite. He was a guy who created a religious cult. His explanation to the cult was that the way for you to go to the next life was for you to take your own life. They all dressed alike. They all dressed in new gym shoes. They laid in their cots. They drank whatever it was that was the magic potion that killed them. And he promised that the UFOs would come and take them to the higher plane. This was one strange duck. You can still look on YouTube and find some of his preachings, his teachings. What a strange person. Ted Bundy. He too was marked by intelligence. Ted Bundy was a very bright guy who had a real peculiar, strange, dangerous, and fatal relationship with women. He may have killed as many as 100, as the slide says. He was a rapist, a kidnapper, a killer. There were a couple of women in his attacks who managed to escape before he killed them, and they were key in identifying him at trial. He did go to law school for a while, and he decided in the final analysis to conduct his own defense. Well, his defense was successful to a point, although he was convicted of the death sentence and was electrocuted in 1989. This is a man who used his charm, used his wiles, and whatever misdirected internal compass toward women to earn him a place in this sociopathic honor roll. Now, this guy was even more weird, but killed fewer people. His name was Ed Gein. If you've ever seen the movie Psycho with Anthony Perkins, or if you've seen Silence of the Lambs, the Silence of the Lambs character, Buffalo Bill, was developed after Ed Gein. In fact, Ed Gein used the skin and body parts of some of his victims for strange decorations and clothing items and belts and all kinds of things like Buffalo Bill did. This guy, in fact, we think murdered a couple of people, including his brother, but he was a grave robber. He would get these bodies by digging up graves. His was a sad and tortured life, but clearly a sociopath who deserves to be in this module. Aileen Wuornos. At long last, we have a woman in these ranks. Now, you can read on the slide what happened to her. She was brutalized, and there is a lot of evidence that shows that people, especially children who are brutalized, sexually assaulted, lose their way and are psychically damaged. So she was made pregnant at age 14, was a prostitute, grand theft, and of course, the people she killed always tended to be men. 7 savage murders of men during this period of a year or so. This was made into a film some years ago starring Charlize Theron in the role of Aileen Wuornos, and the movie was called Monster. You wonder whether there was something organically wrong with her, or whether this abuse and horrible circumstances she suffered during her life may have caused her to be the way she was. Another strange one, of course, the case of John Wayne Gacy. I was living in Chicago during this time when they found him, and they found that his 33 young victims, men and boys, 26 of them he'd buried in the crawl space under his home. The guy was a contractor. He was played a clown at children's parties. He was living among these people in the Chicago suburbs of Des Plaines, but was terribly, terribly disordered. He, in fact, before he went in this killing spree, had been married and had a couple of children, but something was terribly wrong with John Wayne Gacy. He was executed, and when we're together in the classroom, I'll tell you about his execution. Now, this is a young man, Lee Atwater, who was a strategist. He, I submit to you, was a scoundrel because he knew no boundaries for what he would do and what he was willing to do in pursuit of his political aims. There is a wonderful DVD that I show here, Boogeyman, that I suggest to you if you're interested in seeing it. It's strange that he would have died of a brain tumor. Now, some people will say to you that people with organic underlying conditions may in fact give rise to their behaviors. I want to tell you about a push poll. A push poll is a fake public opinion poll. What they will do, and Lee Atwater didn't invent it, but he certainly made use of it. In the year 2000, there was a push poll that was being operated, again, not by Atwater, he was dead by then. The push poll, the pollster would call and say, "Hi, are you a registered voter? Yes, yes, yes. Would you describe your age? And they get you into a couple of questions, and you'd be in the rhythm of the survey. And then they'd ask you a question like this, which was actually in that South Carolina survey. Would it make a difference to you in considering John McCain in your primary vote for president if you knew that he had an illegitimate black daughter in his family?" And of course, the poll is not to get public opinion. It's in fact to plant these sad, devious, and cruel ideas. Now, John McCain and his wife Cindy, in fact, have a number of children between them, but they also have some adopted children. One is a Pakistani girl, and the McCain's always had these wonderful Christmas photographs of them and all the children, and she is dark-skinned, and it was sort of that little bit of truth that these people used in South Carolina to run against George Bush, I guess it was. Yeah. This is one with whom you are familiar, Frank Abagnale. It is a little more cheerful story than the others. Catch Me If You Can was a book, and later the movie. This was a young man who was living in New York City, who went to a nice Catholic high school, and one day one of the brothers said, "Frank, come on, I've got to take you out on an errand." So he took Frank down to the courthouse, where he learned that his parents, for the first time he learned his parents were in the process of a divorce. His mother is sitting on one side of the courtroom, his father on the other side, both represented by counsel. The judge asked the young 16-year-old boy to come forward. "Frank, your parents are getting divorced. Which one would you rather live with?" Now, A, what a cruel way to deal with this. B, imagine the trauma the kid suffered. And he stood there for a minute, gathered himself, and said, "Excuse me, Judge, I have to go to the restroom. I'll be right back." He grabbed his book bag, went to the restroom, and just ran. He just disappeared. He had about $200 in a checking account. He had a part-time job in New York City, so he was able to find work, and he lived with a friend somewhere, and he just ran away and then did all the incredible things that you saw in the movie. Frank Abagnale was eventually arrested, tried, and convicted of massive check forgeries and thefts and all this. Eventually, after they put him in prison, they decided that Frank might make a good expert for the FBI. And they said, Frank, we'll take you out as long as you work with us. He did. He was and still is one of the great experts on bank security, financial fraud, and he has a family and he's turned his life around, and he's a highly regarded speaker and consultant. This is one story of a scoundrel came out of a kind of trauma, a story that has a happy ending. I submit to you that Rick Scott is a scoundrel. He may be a sociopath, but I don't know that. He is currently serving as a United States Senator from the state of Florida. Now, Rick Scott was one of two men who developed this hospital chain back in the 1970s or 80s. And it was very successful. And they grew the hospital chain, and it was bigger and bigger and bigger. And then, near the end of his tenure, he learned that the federal government in Medicare fraud was coming after them. He resigned to the board of directors. He collected his severance package, and it was like the next day that the feds came and scooped up all the records and prosecuted all these people. And of course, his claim is he was never charged with any crime. Now, I submit to you, either he was the mastermind of this and was clever enough to get out in advance, or two, he was too stupid to know that somebody in his company had defrauded Medicare, Medicaid of nearly $2 billion. I submit to you, this guy is a scoundrel who is still at large. Bernie Madoff was one of the biggest thieves in the history of America, convicted, as the slide says, of stealing almost $20 billion. He created an investment scheme. It was a Ponzi scheme. Ponzi scheme was named after a fellow early in the 20th century named Mr. Ponzi, obviously. What he would do is he'd take $10 from this one, 10 from that one, 10 from this one, and then he'd sell a chance to a fourth party, and he'd pay them $15. And the guy says, this is easy money, it's sure money. And of course, he's robbing these people, providing them with a little bit of money from earnings. And this Ponzi scheme captured a lot of very prominent people in America. And it went on for years and years, partly because he was so clever, but he eventually got caught. He now is 82 years old and serving a 150-year prison sentence. This is a scoundrel. This is a guy who apparently has no conscience about stealing from good people and good organizations. Leo Burnett. Leo Burnett founded the famous agency that bore his name. He created modern iconic advertising characters like Tony the Tiger and the Marlboro Man. Each of these ads, in fact, uses the dark art of manipulation, development of appetite. It puts advertising, I submit, at its worst. People knew, including the cigarette companies, knew that cigarette smoking was harmful. Yet Leo Burnett and all the others made money off that misery. And I submit to you, he is one of our scoundrels in the 20th century. Chick Gandil, he was a not so bright baseball player in the Chicago Black Sox, the White Sox, and he was alleged to have been the fixer who solicited the bribes and paid the money out. Although the court, in a very unusual circumstance, acquitted all these guys of the Black Sox scandal, yet Judge Kennesaw Mountain Landis, the commissioner of baseball, banned all of them from baseball. It's a sad reminder of how sports got corrupted by money in the 20th century. So, here they are, scoundrels or sociopaths. Many had these uncommon intellects. Many claimed religion in their lives. None of them could have succeeded, though, if there hadn't been gullibility on the part of their marks and complicity by people in society, nice people like us. Because we look away, it's not a loss that we're suffering, it's somebody else's loss, and this is the shame of the scoundrels and sociopaths in the 20th century.